In this video, we're going to have a look at some of the biggest business or corporate turnarounds in history. Now, that's a very eye-catching way to put it. But actually, so in this module, we talk about adversity and change. And of course, if we do that, we also want to have a look at some examples of companies that not only survived, but actually managed to survive and thrive after they got through adversity. And if we do that, maybe there's something we can learn that we can apply to our own businesses. Now, typically, how you would do it is you would sort of look at the most eye-catching, the most sort of colorful. You would Google it, and then you'd find the most catchy examples of corporate turnarounds. Of course, there's a selection bias in there, so we're going to try to do things a bit differently. We're going to approach it by looking at the biggest companies in the world, which in itself is an interesting exercise. And then we're going to trace their history back, and we're going to see what they went through in order to get to where they are. So the way we're going to do it is first a short intro on the biggest companies, and we're going to look at 5 of them, which actually managed to catch the vast majority of the market capitalization of those companies. So it's really going to be sort of the biggest companies in the world, and then by definition, the biggest corporate turnarounds. Assuming there is no companies that fell off during the ride, which is a survivorship bias thing, which is always there. But yes, it's going to be the biggest turnarounds in history, the way we define it here. And we're going to draw some conclusions. So let's get started. So this is a list of the 10 largest US companies by market cap. Market cap is market capitalization. What is that? Well, you take a company's outstanding shares. Let's say there's 1 million shares and each share costs $10 on the stock exchange. Then the market cap is going to be 10 million. Simple as that. So it's basically the market value of these companies. You could also look at something else, like you could look at revenues, you could look at the number of employees, or some other metric, but this is a kind of nice and dandy metric to look at. There's a lot of statistics available, and it's easy to track in real time, and so on and so forth. So these are the 10 biggest companies in the United States by market cap, but it just so happens that these are also the 10 largest companies in the world by market cap, with 2 exceptions, and those are Saudi Aramco, which is obviously the Saudi government oil company, which is also publicly traded, but it's a government entity in effect, and the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, which is also in top 10 list globally, which is not shown here. So we're going to go through 5 of these. We can say something about every company on the list, but we're going to go through 5 of these, which represent the vast majority of the market cap. So let's get into it. So this is a stock price chart for Apple stock. So basically this goes back to 1985. And yeah, this chart is interesting in itself because it's a linear price chart. And that means that if you look on the right-hand side on the axis here, on the y-axis, it's a linear way to present it. So it's actually quite problematic because you can't really see what happened during all of these years before Apple got into this sort of exponential growth type of territory. So what's often done here is you look at something which is a logarithmic chart instead, which is basically what we're seeing here. And all of these price charts come from Yahoo Finance, which in itself is an interesting business story there, which we're not going to get into here. So Apple is today, and this is sort of late May 2023, it's a $2.75 trillion company, biggest company in the world by market cap. Founded in 1976, IPO'd, so initial public offering in 1980, pretty quickly, you could say. And this is obviously Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs, the 2 co-founders there. Steve Jobs was kicked out in 1985 by this guy whom he had actually recruited himself, and that's an interesting story also, which we're not going to get into. So you can sort of see, actually, when Steve Jobs was kicked out, actually Apple did pretty well for a few years. But getting into the 90s, and I remember this, I grew up with Macs, and in the 90s, Apple sort of lost touch, and Macs were no longer cool. They were expensive and not as fast or not as good as the PCs, the personal computers. So Apple lost touch in the 90s, and you can sort of see the stock price starting to go down here. And then Steve Jobs came back. So first he sold his company to Apple, and then he came back as CEO in 1997. And you can sort of see no immediate change here. It took some time, and what they did was, you can argue, did they get close to bankruptcy or not? Probably they weren't that close to bankruptcy, but they were pretty irrelevant in 1997 when Steve Jobs came back. So they released the iMac, the sort of colorful Macs, in 1998. They did the iBook, so the laptop, in 1999. They did the Apple stores and the iPod in 2001, and then the iTunes store in 2003. iPhone famously 2007, iPad 2010, and then Steve Jobs handed over to Tim Cook in 2011, and then Steve Jobs passed away. But if we sort of look at this thing, so Apple had a big boost from the so-called dot-com boom, which some people might remember, but then it was a big crash. So sort of in the early 2000s, Apple's stock price hadn't actually done that much since sort of 1995. First it went down, then it went up, and then it went sort of down again. But they sort of invested long term, and that's how they got out of it. And the stock price started to go up, and then especially with the iPhone. So if we look at the stock price around the introduction of the iPhone, Apple, it's interesting. The iPhone is actually not Apple's first phone. So they did something with Motorola, which was a music phone, which is also another separate story. There is a lot of stories around these stories. So the iPhone was, strictly speaking, not really Apple's first phone, but they released the iPhone in 2007. And you can see the stock price is sort of in the maybe $3 range here. With these logarithmic scales, which we have here, you can't tell as easily as with the linear scales, but it's sort of in that region. And today it's sort of around $175. So there's a gigantic change. So it's more than a 50-fold increase since they released the iPhone. So sort of what you can learn from here, and then if you look at the Tim Cook period, starting in 2011, the share price is sort of around 10. It's a bit more than 10. And yeah, so it's developed more than tenfold since even Tim Cook took over. So this is called the biggest corporate turnaround in history. So from irrelevance in the 90s to being the biggest company in the world in the sort of around this time, 2023. It's an interesting story, but they sort of invested long term, and it actually took some time before these investments started paying off. And we're going to see that with several cases that it's sort of a pattern there. But yeah, that's the biggest turnaround. Let's move on. So this is Microsoft, and obviously, interestingly, you could say that Microsoft is linked to Apple. They were both founded around the same time. And sort of famously, there was a lot of rivalry between Apple and Microsoft. And part of Apple's turnaround was that they sort of made peace with Microsoft. So they sort of said that, okay, we're not gonna fight Microsoft. And actually, Microsoft invested a small amount of money, so around $150 million in Apple in the 90s when sort of Steve Jobs came back and he famously made peace with Microsoft. But yeah, so Microsoft, $2.4 trillion company today, IPO'd in 86, so sort of after Apple. And then they were on this sort of enormous sort of ride, like the share price just went up and up until Bill Gates handed over to Steve Ballmer in the year 2000, actually sort of perfect timing in January 2000, right before the dot-com crash for those people who remember. That was sort of early, sort of March or around the time of 2000. So Bill Gates handed over to Steve Ballmer, although Bill Gates remained as a chief software architect for a few years after that. But then in the Steve Ballmer era, which is sort of from 2000 until 2014, basically it's 15 years where the stock price did nothing. Like literally Microsoft, like Apple during the 90s, Microsoft was pretty irrelevant. So Microsoft was making money from its legacy products, and it kept developing the Windows operating system, all these things, and the Office suite and that. But kind of Microsoft totally missed out on the mobile phone revolution, really. Microsoft tried to fix it in different ways. They actually acquired Nokia, which is another story which doesn't fit in here. But Microsoft acquired Nokia and tried to use that to kind of be relevant, but that also failed. And they had a lot of lawsuits against them, and they got a lot of penalties, including in the European Union, because of antitrust issues, and they were bundling things and all of that stuff. So for 15 years, Microsoft stock didn't do anything. You could have invested in stamps or exotic cars or something, and probably would have made more money than you would have from Microsoft between the year 2000 and 2014. So that was when the new CEO, who is still the CEO, Satya Nadella, took over. And so during his time, there's been this enormous sort of value creation. So it's around a tenfold increase in market cap from around around $30, around 300 billion in market cap to 2.4 trillion. Not exactly 10 times, but also almost 10 times. And the way he's done it is he's done a bunch of different things, but diversification and innovation. And This is also usually listed as one of the really, really big turnarounds in corporate history. And today, Microsoft is a cool company. Like it cannot be overstated how uncool Microsoft was even in the 90s, but especially in the 2000s. Like it was like the most uncool company. So that's a huge turnaround, both in terms of value creation and in terms of obviously the products and services they've launched and developed, which those two things are obviously linked. So let's move on. Amazon, another one of these huge companies. So it's a $1.2 trillion market cap today, as of late May 2023. So Amazon started in 1994. They IPO'd in 97, which was a pretty quick IPO. And obviously Jeff Bezos and all that stuff. So he had this sort of super aggressive strategy. Started with sort of selling books, and then not only that, but they IPO'd quickly in 97, and that's before the dot-com bubble. So they could sort of ride this. They could ride the internet boom of the late 90s, and they did really do that. So this is a huge increase in stock price during the dot-com bubble. But then they crashed. So they had around 90% sort of loss of market cap during the dot-com crash. And they came close to bankruptcy in the sense that they had a new CFO, Chief Financial Officer, who came in and sort of managed to raise cash for Amazon right before the crash. And it's literally a matter of weeks, according to different stories. So if Amazon hadn't done that, because Amazon wasn't making money for probably around 10 years or something like that. So they were just investing in growth and all that stuff. And you could argue, like, is Amazon really a good idea? It's not clear. The jury is out. Or you could actually say that the jury actually made its verdict. And basically the verdict is that Amazon's business doesn't make any sense except for one thing, which we're going to get to. So Amazon launched Amazon Web Services in 2002. That was something that they did internally for themselves or for their sort of e-commerce business. And then it just kind of turned out that then they sort of expanded access so other people could start using their service and all that stuff. And it's really mind-blowing. So these numbers are 2021, but it's probably going to be the same for 2022. So these numbers are mind-blowing. So Amazon Web Services is around 15% of revenue, but it's 75% of gross profit for Amazon. It's really unbelievable. So basically, and that was launched in 2002, 20 years ago. It's crazy. And of course, the Amazon stock price is up much more than 100x since then. So they came down to probably 20, 30 cents. Again, this is a logarithmic scale. So they came down to sort of, let's say, around 30 cents during the dot-com crash. And now they're at more than $100 per share. So that's sort of a 300x plus times increase in the share price. But in terms of revenue, it's all of Amazon, like all of the things they sell, and there are third-party sellers that sell that are driving revenue. But in terms of profits, it's really Amazon Web Services. So Amazon today is sort of a server company, although it's not really labeled as that. And it started as this sort of really, really kind of thing which they did for themselves back in 2002, again, more than 20 years ago. So this is the story of really sort of Amazon and all of this kind of value creation. And that's not how it's always labeled, but that's really what it is. So forget about the books and all the other stuff, electronics you buy. It's really a cloud server company, competing with Microsoft, obviously, Microsoft Azure, and competing with Google's cloud services also. But yeah, that's Amazon, another $1 trillion plus company. If we move on, we get to this company called Berkshire Hathaway. Now, what is Berkshire Hathaway? For those who know, sort of who are into investments, it's a very famous company. We've mentioned Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger on the program before. So Berkshire Hathaway, it's a $700 billion company today. It's really a conglomerate. It's sort of one of the few. So a conglomerate is a sort of a holding company. It's a structure where there's many different companies inside the same structure. It's actually hard to make conglomerates work. It's famously very, very hard. They usually fail. So General Electric, GE, is a failed conglomerate, but Berkshire Hathaway is sort of the big success story there. Although Berkshire is different, it's more of a holding, a strict sort of investment company. It's not really an industrial conglomerate as GE was or is or was. So Berkshire Hathaway was founded in 1839, and it's a fascinating story. It was a textile company. And then through different mergers, it led to the formation of Berkshire Hathaway in 1955, when Warren Buffett was sort of already starting to be active. And then Warren Buffett bought Berkshire Hathaway in the 1960s. Again, that's a fascinating story. It was supposed to be the other way around. He was supposed to sell Berkshire Hathaway, but then the buyer came back with a lowballer price, and Warren Buffett got pissed at him. So he sort of changed it and instead sort of bought Berkshire Hathaway for himself or for his fund or partnership. And then Berkshire Hathaway became an investment company. So Warren Buffett started using Berkshire Hathaway cash flows and sort of buy other things. And then after a long while, in 1985, they shut down the textile operation. And Warren Buffett has actually called buying Berkshire Hathaway his biggest mistake or biggest investment mistake. Now, Berkshire Hathaway doesn't pay dividends, but if you look at the share price here, so this is sort of tracking back to 1980 when Berkshire Hathaway IPO'd at around $290 per share. If you compound that, it's almost 40%, but if you compound that during 43 years up until sort of spring of 2023, you get to around the current share price. So the point being that if you compound that almost or around 40%, then you're going to get to today's share price. And this is for Berkshire Hathaway A shares. So they have A shares and B shares, and that's another thing we haven't really spoken about. But if you list on the stock exchange, or even if you don't, you can have different share classes. So A shares, B shares, C shares, D shares, whatever. So this is for the A share, and they also have a B share. But yeah, so crazy compounding. And this is another sort of example of the power of compounding here to get to this crazy share price, which they have today. And it's an enormous turnaround story in the sense that it started as a textile company, and now it's one of the world's biggest companies. It's really crazy when you think about it. The reason Buffett called it his biggest mistake is that he invested into Berkshire Hathaway or buying those shares, and actually, if he wouldn't have done that, if we would have put that money into other investments directly, he would have made much more money. So that's, objectively speaking, that was a huge mistake that he made there. So probably losing billions or tens or hundreds of billions of dollars by actually sort of buying this failing textile company. Interesting story, but yeah, a very sort of particular story right there. But let's move on. So we get now to Tesla. So Tesla is a company that a lot of people are following or have been following. It's a fascinating story. Tesla is today, it's around $600 billion. They've sort of been around 1 trillion as well. Maybe they'll get back there, who knows? Maybe yes, maybe no. So Tesla was founded in 2003 and actually not founded by Elon Musk, but Elon Musk came in as an investor. So he became the largest shareholder in 2004. And then he sort of became step by step more and more active in the company. And so Elon Musk is not only considered, but he's even legally a co-founder of Tesla, because they made an agreement between themselves. Like 5 people have the right to call themselves co-founders of Tesla, which is in itself fascinating and all that stuff. So they launched the Roadster in 2006 and started delivering in 2008. And then they came very close to bankruptcy. And sort of the story of Tesla is a story of near-death experiences. It's been this sort of, you can call it a gamble or not, depending on what you like, but they've been close to bankruptcy many times during their history. And they came, according to Musk himself, which may or may not be a reliable source, but they came close to bankruptcy around Christmas 2008. So they had a funding round and they didn't manage to close it, and they only closed it at 6 p.m. on Christmas Eve 2008, after sort of Elon Musk committed his last cash reserves to the fundraise. And then they were, not very long thereafter, they got a huge and sort of favorable terms. They got a loan from the US government, which is part of this sort of subsidy, not subsidy program, but support program that the US government had to support new technologies and solar technologies and that kind of stuff. But Tesla got a big chunk of that, so almost $500 million. And that arguably also saved Tesla. So they got this like very big cash injection from the US government, and they could use part of that to buy their factory, which they then used to build all their cars, and they bought that from Toyota, which also in itself is an interesting history. And we could look at that. Toyota went bankrupt also probably around 3 times and was saved by the Japanese government. But that's a story for another time. Then Tesla went public in 2010, and that was a highly successful IPO. It wasn't a very cheap company even back then, but obviously if you bought that IPO, then you would have made a chunk load of money. But yes, then they had the Model S production, which started in 2012, which was a small sort of volume, low volume, premium sedan car, as we all know. Then they probably had some other problems because the Model S was obviously delayed as everything else. They put a lot of resources into the Model X. Probably a bad business decision to build the Model X. It didn't make any sense really, and too complex and all that stuff. But then with the Model 3, they wanted to go sort of more mass market, and then they were in production hell for a period of time from 2017 to 19, around that time, and they almost went bankrupt. So Musk has again said that they were around a month from bankruptcy, and he famously, supposedly slept on the factory floor, still waiting for photos. Maybe there are some photos, but so yeah, their history is a history of sort of playing and maybe roulette or maybe not, but sort of being close to bankruptcy many times, and then obviously now it's one of the most valuable companies in the world, and they do not have any sort of financial difficulties right now. But who knows what happens in the future? They have a tendency to play with high stakes. So yeah, that's the story of Tesla. There's a lot to be said there, and it's an interesting story. So if we sort of recap here, these again are the 10 largest US companies. We spoke about Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Berkshire Hathaway, Tesla. So those are 5 of the 10, and this is the 5 that we went through are vast majority of the market cap of these 10. Now, if you look at Alphabet or Google, you could make a turnaround story there if you wanted to as well. They started as a university project, so also in a sense publicly funded. If you look at it, actually, Apple also had public grants, and a lot of these companies actually had public money invested into them or some sort of public support, and that's a narrative that you do not always hear. But yeah, Alphabet or Google, they started as a university project, and then they actually wrote a paper back in '98 where they said that advertising is sort of bad, like you shouldn't have advertising if you have a search engine. So you could argue that the entire story of Google, as it's known today, is a turnaround from their early university days when they were against advertising, and today, obviously, famously, Google or Alphabet is a money-making machine when it comes to advertising. Nvidia is Nvidia, not a lot to be said there. Meta, you could argue, of course, that Meta also changed from being a university project to being this sort of public company driven by advertising. Visa is an interesting example. We could talk about that for hours. They started as a Bank America card type of thing locally, and it was a failure. They had like a lot of fraud, and they didn't make it work. And it was launched in 1958, and then in 1970, it sort of became, they sort of opened up for partners, and then it sort of became the Visa that we know today. But yeah, it's an interesting story how that came about, and that was a failure that sort of became a big success. United Health, we're not going to talk about. But yeah, so this is very interesting. And then let's sort of move to conclusions. What can we learn from all this? Because obviously that's one of the main reasons we go through this list, apart from it being a lot of fun. But yes, almost every big company has faced a crisis. And probably if you look closely enough, every company and sort of every company that made it has faced a crisis at some point. So crises are sort of normal. But then, okay, next step is obviously you then need to be prepared for crises or crunches. It's good to have extra cash. And actually, this is an interesting point here. So cash, you would think when you run a business that it's not good to have too much cash, because you're like sitting on this cash, it's not earning any interest, like you should invest this cash, you should do something with the cash. But cash has a lot of optionality, and the best investors sort of know this. So if you think about Berkshire Hathaway, for example, then they sit on a lot of cash, and they can use that cash to buy companies when nobody else can buy companies. And that's how they bought Coca-Cola, for example. They were always ready to buy stuff when stuff was cheap. So cash has a lot of optionality. It's a bit counterintuitive. Fundraising can be a core skill. So definitely for Tesla, but also for somebody like Apple, fundraising, and for Amazon for sure. Amazon huge example of where fundraising has really been like a core skill. If they hadn't managed to fundraise right before the dot-com crash, maybe there wouldn't be any Amazon today. One important point that we want to make here is that there is a survivor bias. So what does that mean? So basically, if you look at any list of successes, be it sort of successful companies or successful athletes or whatever, you're going to have a survivor bias. So you're only seeing, in that list, you're only seeing the success stories. You're not seeing the failure. So that's something we have to keep in mind here. We cannot be sure that just by studying these highly successful companies that we will sort of identify some magic patterns that can also make ourselves successful. So keep that in mind. You can be fooled by randomness. Maybe these companies just gambled and they got lucky and they won. Maybe not, but that's something we have to keep in mind anytime we study sort of these success stories. That's not usually how it's framed on business programs, but it's important to know. So turnarounds, another conclusion, obviously, turnarounds take time. And yeah, like there's usually not any quick fixes. You can do things in the short term, like when Steve Jobs came back and he launched the iMac, which became a sales success, and they made money from that, which they could then use to fund other projects. And Tesla, similarly, they launched the Roadster and then the Model S, and they could use that money that they made from those cars to finance the development of other models. But yeah, even if turnarounds take time, then compounding is enormously powerful. So think about sort of Berkshire Hathaway with a 40% annual compounding rate, so basically growth rate. Then you can sort of go from this $290 share price 43 years ago to the $480, roughly $1,000 share price today. So think of the rule of 72. It's something we mentioned before. It's a mental model. So let's say you grow by 25% per year, which doesn't sound like a crazy amount, but actually in 3 years, you're going to double. Meaning in 6 years, you have 4 times what you had, and in 9 years, you have 8 times. So basically, if you grow by 25%, then in around 10 years, you're going to 10x your company. And obviously, that's what we've seen with, for example, Microsoft. They have roughly 10x'd in 10 years by growing only 25% per year. So 25% per year is not that bad. Power of compounding, yes. And last thing before we move on is there's a famous story on the power of compounding or exponential functions. And allegedly, there are many different versions of this story. Allegedly, the guy who invented the chessboard went to the ruler and said that, can I be paid for this great invention? And the ruler said, fine. Would you want to be paid? And the guy said, I just want to be paid different versions again, like 1 corn of rice or 1 piece of wheat on the first square, and then like just 2 more on the second, and like 4 on the third, and 8 on the fourth, and so on and so forth. So the ruler said, yeah, fine, that's cheap, ha ha ha. But then you get to this, right? And then, so you double the number of wheat or rice on each square. And then if you sort of do this exercise, which you can't, but if you would, the pile of wheat or rice at the end of the board would be sort of the size of Mount Everest, literally. So that's the power of compounding. Let's leave it at that. And yeah, looking forward to seeing everybody on the next video.